Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we have three wonderful cartoonists for you, and the toilets are downstairs if you need them. Those statements aren't linked at all. So on my far left, David Pope, currently doing the cartoons for the Canberra Times, and in the middle is Stuart McMillen. Now, Stuart, how should I describe you?
Freelance science communicator, cartoonist.
He's for hire. He's for hire, ladies and gentlemen. Stuart's for hire. And immediately to my left, Geoff Pryor, living legend, Canberra Times cartoonist for 26, 24, 34, about 37, 36 years?
30 years for the Canberra Times and,
30 years.
And a little bit longer either side.
Okay, we're delighted to welcome them. So the format of this evening is going to be, we're going to have a short conversation out the front, about 15 minutes, and then each one of the three cartoonists has got exactly 7 minutes to talk about their stuff and present some examples of what they do or did, and then we'll come back, convene as a whole group, and that's an opportunity for you to ask them questions and interject points and express your point of view. So that's how it goes. So, David, what was the route to cartooning for you? How did you get there?
I just started drawing cartoons for various activist organisations I was involved in when I was young. So the peace movement to start with, and just to help fill the spaces in leaflets and things. And over time, it became more of an occupation. And sometime down the track, I made a decision to do it.
So are you a refugee from art school, or what?
No. I just picked it up as I went along.
Picked it up. Now, Stuart, you described your life at the moment as swinging like Tarzan through the trees.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is a reference to your mighty physique or your lifestyle.
Yeah, well, this will be good on the podcast. They'll think I've got a good physique, won't they?
Yeah.
So, essentially, I did a university degree that's now irrelevant to my life, and I was working
Look, I can't let that statement go by. What was it in?
Well, it was a business management degree, so I suppose I am using that as, in some way these days.
Yeah,
but,
the confessions start early, don't they? Business management, yeah. And then after you went down that dead end?
Well, I had a 9-to-5 job for 5 years, but at that point in time I was learning all these things about the environment and sustainability, and I wanted to share them with the world, and I thought, well, am I going to write a blog and join one of the many other millions of blogs on the net, or should I try and have a cartoon-themed way of presenting these ideas?
So are you the author of manga comics? Is that how you picture yourself?
Manga
comics? You know, no. Manga, these Japanese-influenced comics that you start at the back page and work towards the front?
I've got no Japanese influence at all.
I'll come to that manga comics. Who's heard of manga comics in the room? Okay, right. The most famous one was Astro Boy, which was converted into a TV series you might have seen when you were a child.
Yeah.
So, Geoff, tell me, your daily... You'd rock up at work and you'd get in... Being a cartoonist, I guess you'd get in at a leisurely hour about 10 o'clock, you'd flick through the newspapers, you'd listen to the radio, you'd sit at your desk, you'd look out the window, and what happened next?
10 o'clock? More like 3 o'clock.
Oh, 3 o'clock.
Day would start with the first Radio National Bulletin for me at around about 6:30 or 7, and that's just catching up on what had happened around the world during the night, and then reading. I used to get about 3 newspapers a day, and I'd read those. I'd read one cover to cover for news, and then I'd top up with others, and then listening to news bulletins on ABC throughout the day. And it got to the stage that I could reach out and turn on a radio, something clock inside my head would tell me to do it, just to hear the ABC fanfare at the beginning of the bulletin. And it was uncanny, but it was such a routine. And then getting into work after lunch at about 3, reading maybe a couple more newspapers, and then talking to people if I felt I needed to. Basically not starting work until at least 6 in the evening, because in the days before the 24-hour news cycle, politicians would have their press conferences at about between 5 and 6 in the afternoon, giving the media enough time to package for the evening news bulletins. so that there's a useful time to wait until that had happened. And it was also useful not to start too early in the day, because events could change, and a wonderful idea that had been dreamed up could just go out the window.
That's a wonderful excuse for not getting to work at 10 o'clock. You know, events might change. David, is that your modus operandi? Because you've stepped in to fill Geoff's shoes.
Look, it's changed. I think it's changed a lot now, and Geoff's already alluded to the 24-hour news cycle. So press conferences will happen through the day. They'll be shown live immediately on News 24 or Sky. There'll be Twitter feeds going on where stuff breaks. Sort of social media is sort of constant now, and you're not just producing work, you're interacting with people who are responding to it. And it's a 24-hour thing. So trying to contain that to a sort of manageable pace is the trick.
So I guess the question, probably more appropriate for you two rather than Stuart, but what's your relationship with the editor? I mean, do you go to the editor at 6 o'clock and say, hey, boss, here are 3 alternatives, or do you say, here's my cartoon for the day, take it or leave it?
Well, one thing I think, a valuable thing I got from Geoff, a piece of advice, and I mean, it's something. Before I worked at the Canberra Times, I worked at the Sun Herald and other places, but the advice passed on from Geoff early on was don't let the editor choose what your comment is going to be. It's your space and it's your comment, and I've tried to keep to that. But I do take roughs to people to get their opinion, because I'm not necessarily the best judge of how an idea is received. So I normally try and take a couple of ideas to show the night editor, the editor who actually puts the paper together, get their response, and the response from other people if I'm still not sure about it. But I'm showing them ideas that are attempts to express what I want to say.
Yeah.
But I'm really pretty much left to my own devices. I mean, I think that's a legacy of Geoff's carving out that space in the paper. And it's a role for cartoonists that's developed in Australia over periods of decades, where cartoonists used to be the editorial scribes. You know, they were really, and are still the case in some papers today, where the editors basically hand over the idea to certain people and they draw it up. But over a long period, the best newspapers have developed the convention that the cartoonist is an author, and that it's their voice, not the paper's voice. Yeah.
Independent space, staked out
comment.
like a gold territory.
I was going to say that's one of the virtues of working for a paper like the Canberra Times. In 30 years, I never had an editor tell me what to do, ever. And I showed the editor, it was really a fait accompli, this is what I'm doing. And editor was happy, but I did have tasters around the office, a couple of people whose level of understanding I could rely on. And if they looked at one of my drafts and decided, oh, it doesn't quite come off, I can't quite get that, I'd say, right, thank you, and take it away, scrub it, and then work again, because that saved me a heap of embarrassment in the paper the next day. And sometimes you can't rely on editors, because they've been in the business for so long, they can recognise a piece of good writing reading the first sentence and say that's good.
Can I just ask a question of Stuart? Stuart works in long-form graphic novels.
Yeah.
You know. How do you go about getting that sort of feedback about the work that you're producing, which is, over a whole book, not just a single cartoon?
Yeah, well, mine tend to be about non-fiction events, so my first port of call is to try and work out what I think the correct position is based on the science and the historical evidence that I can find, whether something did actually happen. And then once I've got my take on the world together, I'll sort of show that to people who are experts in the field to have them try and shoot holes in the validity of it. I have actually abandoned certain storylines because I couldn't find data to support what felt like a good idea at the first place, or I have changed things because people have said, no, you can't actually say that. That's beyond what the science says. So I don't want to overstep any boundaries of correctness if I can.
Well, I think that leads on to the next question, and that is, I know, Geoff, you're the son of a notable scientist, and also your brother was a CSIRO, Poss was a CSIRO scientist. But how much science have you guys got in you? I mean, did you? I mean, look, I have to confess, I I've got a B pass in the New South Wales Leaving Certificate in Physics. This is my highest science qualification. So it's time for confessions. Where you go, David? What have you got?
Well, just a physics at high school. I mean, my father was a computer programmer, and there was science stuff around the house. But and I had an idea before cartooning that I would go into that field that and graphics were my two interests.
Okay.
But in terms of pursuing it beyond that, that's it. Yeah. But in later years, I have much more of an interest in ecological sciences and climate science, because that is just, and that's what I'll talk about in a minute, just the way it's intersected with politics over the last decade or so.
I loved science at high school, but I didn't go beyond that into any sort of university degree. But I did get very high marks at biology in particular in school. And I've continued just to enjoy learning about the process of scientific thought and incorporating that into the way I look at the world as much as possible.
Well, for me, no. No science. Although I was immersed in a world where a lot of science talk went on. The family had a weekender at Captain's Flat. My father...
What, a Captain's Flat, a weekender?
Well, it was a hobby farm. Well, it was a boutique forest, in actual fact. My father, being a forester, wanted to establish his own pine plantation on his own account rather than advising other people how to do it. And this is something that he'd wanted to do. So for many, many years, we owned it for over 30 years, we would travel out to Captain's Flat each weekend, the old Toyota, and there was a lot of argument and science talk going on there. So I'm vicariously immersed in it, you can say, at that sort of level. My brother, he died in April this year, the day before Anzac Day, but he was a plant geneticist in plant industry, working. He was a maize expert and working on disease resistance and genetic modification and so forth. So there was a bit of talk about that, and I tried to keep up with him, and he was pretty tolerant of me, but it was good talk.
There's a richness of science topics that are around at the moment in terms of the interface between politics and science, I think, and you've got everything ranging from vaccination issues, you've got climate change issues, we've had the tobacco debate is almost won and lost and so on. So where do you seek your inspiration? I think, David, you said you're interested in climate change and ecological issues.
So yes, I am. And where do I get my information from, or where do I draw my inspiration from?
What sort of science topics do you see as potential subjects for your cartooning?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's climate change just springs to mind because it's been such a hot issue since, certainly since the 2007 election, or in the lead up to that, and that just forces that's. And the debate's really polarised around that, so that's really forces anyone who comments in the area to get up to speed, because it's an area where if I draw a cartoon, and I think I worked out, preparing for this, I've drawn about 250 cartoons on climate politics since Rudd was elected, and those cartoons draw the most vociferous response from a right-wing politics that's very aggressively opposed to the science. So that'll attract the most hate of the stuff I produce, and that forces you to use resources like Trevor Cook's Skeptical Science website, and just to read up generally, and read the IPCC reports and all the stuff around it, so that you can manage that.
An astoundingly divisive issue. I mean, if you read the comments coming through from any article in, say, The Conversation or some of those other, I mean, it really brings the trolls out.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So how broadly do you stretch, Stuart? Are you sort of like a cab for hire? You'll write your cartoons on any subject that you're commissioned for, and where do you tend to specialise?
Well, I tend to like drawing the comics that I've researched, written and drawn myself, and I just try and find ways to fund them, which has included crowdfunding and you name it, arts grants, that sort of thing. I guess I initially saw myself as an environmental, ecological commentator to start with, but then about 2 years ago I got really interested in drug politics and drug science, so I then went into an avenue of social commentary comics, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes' time. And I'm currently working on a 400-page graphic novel which is about basically the intersection of the way the natural ecological world works and the way the human economic world works, and the way that they're often at cross paths, and how do we go forward in a way that where the economy and the ecology are sort of singing the same tune.
We look forward to that one, 400 page.
I've done 86 pages as of this afternoon.
Excellent. My point of view, cartoonists are necessarily, or political cartoonists and newspapers are necessarily generalists. So you're really responding to what's happening on the day, what will have the carriage of the day, and that's always the first problem, is choosing the issue that you believe is going to have the carriage that the readers are going to know about. So if it was science, if it was a science issue, science funding was one that I commented on a bit, because I got feedback on that, particularly from my brother and some of his friends in the lab. And greenhouse pollution, growing pollution, the issues as they came along. One of my self-made difficulties is that being a born and bred Canberra person, I grew up amongst a cohort of people who went on to do different things, and some became senior bureaucrats, others not so successfully became lawyers. I was the least successful of all because I failed a law degree, and others, became scientists today, and they had their various fields of interest. And for me, one of my concerns was, if I was going to do a cartoon on a subject, it had to make sense.
That's a shame.
This cohort of people out there, if I don't think I'm giving them what they'll appreciate, if it's too simplistic, then I will have failed that day. So I was always concerned about being informed and having I suppose, as sophisticated a point of view as I could develop. And this meant for me talking to a lot of people. I had a friend in defence, senior policymaker in defence, and I could talk to him at length about defence policy, and had my brother, I could talk to him about science, and so forth. So that was part of my concern. As I say, it was purely self-imposed. I was probably better off not knowing anything.
All right, we'll come back, and you've got an opportunity to ask questions later on, but let me invite David now, and David's going to show some slides, and he's going to talk for about 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to the other two speakers as well.
So I felt a bit embarrassed about even coming along tonight, because as Geoff said, political cartoonists, we are generalists rather than specialists, and so to talking in front of a bunch of people who do actually communicate science for a living, I'll show you my attempts at miscommunication of the superficial science. But what I was going to focus on climate policy, as I just mentioned before, climate science, and I'll show a handful of cartoons where I've picked out of the 250 odd that were done since Rudd was elected, which at least try and touch on some of the science issues. And I'd be interested to hear back from people at the end or later on to get your impressions about what needs to be said, what needs to be said in this area about the science, what issues need to be communicated. As a political cartoonist, the daily search is the search for a metaphor on the news of the day. And that's the great struggle each day, is to find some metaphor that you can hang your hat on. I'm interested to hear what metaphors you think might be useful for communicating on this issue. This is a cartoon that was drawn when Frank Fenner died in 2010, The Canary in the Coal Mining Country. And it's just got a quote from Frank: "Climate change is just at the very beginning. It's an irreversible situation. I think it's too late." I try not to express that because people are trying to do something, but they keep putting it off. Now, it's not a funny cartoon, but he just died a significant figure, I thought, and I thought newsworthy as a way of actually hanging a comment about climate, sort of reminding us about what he was reminding us about the importance of this issue, that it's a huge issue, it's not going away, and that it's an issue that has to be addressed. But most of the cartoons I do on the climate science, here's a cartoon from when Abbott was just, the new government was elected, Action Day 1. We've got the IPCC here and a fibre of science being brought up to the cabinet. Just run it to the node, says Abbott. And the lack of a science minister in the cabinet being sort of question mark about how well science issues will be communicated to this government and then reflected in policy. So generally I'm commenting in these daily cartoons about science policy or the politics around science, not so much the science itself. But I'll go through perhaps a handful of cartoons where the metaphors do touch on some of the issues in the science. I should just mention perhaps the first message in the cartoons about climate science that I'm trying to get across is that the debate in this area in Australia cannot be understood without recognising how it's mediated by the economic interests that are built around resources and export of carbon. So this is a cartoon from the Rudd era. It's got Welcome to Country, Kevin Rudd standing on top of a bunch of coal exports. But first I'd like to make the customary token acknowledgement of the peoples of the CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology, traditional custodians of the climate data upon which we now stand. And so I try in any of the climate cartoons to have some acknowledgement that Australia is a resource exporting economy. It very much skews the debate in this country, just as it skews it in a place like Canada. So most of the cartoons I do, this was one that was exhibited in France. It was published on the day that the carbon tax was repealed, and just trying to find a simple image that reminds us that what the dominant forces are in this debate are, with some harking to some of the impacts of climate change that are expected in this country, increasing intense sort of fire seasons and things like that. So in terms of the actual metaphors that touch on the science, and this is from last summer, the Angry Summer Weather Records Balloon Spectacular. And it doesn't come up too well here, but I've tried to put in a number of the records that the Bureau of Meteorology released at the end of last summer. And you've got a climate action balloon that you would think would be buoyed by this sort of terrible news and the sort of dragnet just down here, the Prime Minister. This is an attempt to have a little bit of information, and I find this is a problem with cartoons as a way of... cartoons aren't really designed, single panel cartoons, not the stuff that Stuart does, to convey information. They really rely on the information being in people's heads already. That premise has to be already established amongst your readership, and then you riff off that. You've usually only got a few seconds for the cartoon to deliver its punchline and to make the comment. So to actually put information into a cartoon can often render it fairly lifeless, didactic, and can work against the humour of it often. So I'm not sure how successful attempts to do it are, and I've got a couple here, and you can judge for yourselves. So here's an attempt to talk about the difference between the impact of El Nino and global warming on Australia's temperature. So I've got Australia here. I don't even know. It's really hard. It's like trying to explain a cartoon. Australia, El Nino, anthropogenic global warming. It's like this sort of bedroom scene where El Nino has walked in to find Australia is actually getting hot with someone else, and in this case it's global warming. Again, this is hung on a Bureau of Meteorology story that would have been on the front page that day. So, and again, an attempt to talk about this sort of the hot temperatures that we're having, and not even an El Nino year when you'd expect that to have an impact, that global warming is starting to be felt in the temperature record. So an attempt to capture this scientific idea. I'm not sure how successful, and that's what I'll get you to feedback. The next one here is the frog in the pot. We've got a sort of CO2 glad wrap here over the cartoon trope of the boiling frog in the pot. But look at all this steam. I mean, it's dripping a flood in here. So much for we're all going to fry. The story of the other frog in the pot. And this was drawn at the time when Tim Flannery and others were being ridiculed by sections of the sort of climate denialist movement when the floods happened after the big dry, and an attempt to talk about extremes, that the energy being trapped in the system and that leading to not just some sort of linear heating of the planet, but in energy being trapped in the system and leading to extreme events like, and not causing them, but increasing their frequency and intensity. So this one here is the Climate Commission releasing its one of its reports. I can't remember when it was, 2011. And make sure you leave enough room for the desperate 11th hour tunnelling operation. And it's an attempt, in the context of the article, about how the exit windows were narrowing the longer we left taking action. So trying to find a metaphor that showed this exit window, and in this case an exit door, shrinking the longer we waited. And I think the final one I've got here, oh no, two more. Hurricane Sandy at the time. We've got climate disaster at the door in the US. Although with all the greenhouse gases already pumped into the system, it's now going to have to be trick and treat. So this was at the time of Halloween. So I'm using Halloween at the time as part of the metaphor and talking about the fact, trying to start to convey the idea that this problem is not just one of that we can turn on and off like a switch, that the gases that are accumulated in the system will continue to have impacts even when we do manage to cut back emissions. And the final example where there's some science in it is when Bill McKibben came to town. Please say hello to today's Relief Teacher Australia. Good morning, Mr. McKibben. And this is another attempt to put some information here. It's actually sort of his carbon budget, very basic carbon budget stuff. And he was actually in Canberra the night before this cartoon was published. And in fact, I had to race to get it finished because I wanted to go and see this talk. And I got this cartoon done, raced down to the thing and sat to the talk, and he's talking about the only numbers you need to know are these numbers, and they were different to the numbers I'd written down in the cartoon. Just slightly, but it was because I was going off a report by one of our reporters at the Sydney Morning Herald who'd got it wrong slightly, mistranscribed it. So I raced out of the thing and said, I've got to change the cartoon, and fortunately they held the page and we fixed the figures up. But it's got today's math, staying under 2 degrees global warming, the carbon we can burn, divided by the carbon about to be dug up, question mark. And then you've got Campbell Newman from Queensland. Will we be tested on this, sir, or can I just not give a Gonski? Now, this wasn't the most newsworthy thing of the day. It was a big event, it turned out. A lot of people turned out to see him, and it was a story in the paper. It wasn't a front page story. So this is me deciding I want to make a comment about this, but running the risk that most people aren't going to know who Bill McKibben is if they don't, and certainly if they miss that story, part of the story in the paper. And that's, it's a real risk with that cartoon. It could just fall flat, not mean anything to people. So, and again, an attempt to put some information in. Is that my 7 minutes?
Yeah, that's
your 10
minutes.
10, no, you're supposed to stop me because 7, yes, great. Okay, I'll talk to you in a minute.
Thanks, David. So let's have our author of Stuart. Come on down, Stuart.
Hey, has anyone seen any of my comics before? Oh, that's good. Okay, so you probably know that they go on for quite a while. So I could either show you my stuff or I could tell you about the underlying philosophy behind my comics. And I've chosen to tell you about what I think of and how I do my science communication with comics. So I'll be talking about 2 comics in particular. The first one being a comic called St. Matthew Island, which is a true thing that happened in the middle of the last century about scientists introducing, or human beings introducing 29 reindeer to an isolated island in the middle of the ocean. So, isolated island, free from people, free from predators. The guys introduced 29 reindeer, and over the course of the next few decades, the population exploded to 6,000 reindeer and then plummeted down to 0 after the reindeer ate all the food on the island. second comic I'll be talking about is called Rat Park, which is another real-life story. It's about some drug experiments that were done comparing the drug-taking behaviours of rats in solitary confinement versus rats in a large social enclosure called Rat Park. And to cut a long story very, very, very short, essentially they found rats in solitary confinement in cages were very likely to take drugs and become addicted to drugs, but rats in this large social spacious enclosure chose not to not only become addicted to drugs, but to take drugs in general. So I guess the premise of the research that these guys did was sort of questioning the idea that you'll become automatically addicted to drugs by taking them in the first place. So as I mentioned earlier on, my reason for becoming a cartoonist in the first place is because I want to take ideas out of my brain and put them in the brains of other people. And this was particularly the case with environmental issues when I first started drawing. And essentially I thought, wouldn't it be great if everyone could share my attitudes and beliefs towards the environment? But I guess my early attempts at influencing people weren't as successful, and I realised that if you're trying to influence people when writing stories, you basically have two main approaches that you can have as a storyteller. So the first approach is what I call the Captain Planet approach to storytelling. And now if you don't know who Captain Planet is, he's the guy with the green mullet, the red underpants, and the blue testicle. And I don't know if anyone's actually watched the Captain Planet TV show lately on YouTube, for example, but basically the way that they go about trying to get kids to care about the environment is basically pure propaganda. So he doesn't give the readers any latitude to think for themselves or to reason their way to think that maybe I should care about the environment. It's just all these slogans like, you must recycle, you must not litter, you must turn the lights off in your bedroom when you go out. And you know, that might work for 10-year-olds, but I realised with my comics that are written with adults in mind, the downside with writing a propaganda comic or a propaganda anything is that the only people who respond to propaganda are the people who believe it in the first place. It's a little bit like getting a flyer from a political party that you really hate. It might make a lot of sense to someone who already shares that worldview, but to everyone else, it just seems like a really one-eyed take on the world. So my early comics actually, unfortunately, use the Captain Planet approach, but I've found another way of writing stories, which is what I've used in St Matthew Island and Rat Park. So if you go home and read these stories, you'll notice that the way I tell the story is very much just laying out the facts of the situation and chronologically stepping the reader through the real events that actually took place. And my motivation for drawing the comics was to make people feel a certain way at the end, but I found that I didn't actually need to come to a Captain Planet propaganda conclusion at the end, saying, okay, we need to care about overpopulation and we need to cut down on our fossil fuel use. And I find that it's not necessary if you have a story which is well told and leading to a conclusion. You don't tend to need to tell people what the conclusion is because, and maybe the other science communicators in the room will agree with me, but it often is better if people come to the conclusion themselves because it feels as though the answer has come from within. So that's basically the way that I approach the way I write my stories. The metaphor that I imagine is it's like a snooker table, and I want people to take a particular shot. So I'll get all of the balls out of the way, I'll put the snooker ball in the corner pocket of the table, but ultimately I leave it up to the reader to make the shot. Now there's a risk that they won't quite come to the conclusion that I came to, but if they do, which I try and make it as easy as possible for them, it's ultimately a more satisfying experience if the reader comes to the epiphany at the end on their own. So I'm at the very end of my talk at the moment, But I just wanted to finish with a piece of audience participation in reference to the third comic I was going to talk tonight about, War on Drugs. I noticed as we all came into the event tonight, we were given a free drink. So I'd like everyone just to raise your glasses in a social experiment at the moment. Okay, so we've got our glasses in the air. I'd like everyone who has ever used drugs to please lower your glasses. I see someone with a half-drunk beer glass has his glass up at the back of the room. This is sort of the underlying what I was wrestling with when I wrote and drew my comic War on Drugs, because I realised that we have a very schizophrenic way of we somehow think that alcohol isn't a drug and that it's in its own category of its own, and we should we can be cool and treat alcohol users as though they're a responsible human being, but when it comes to drug users, we do everything we can to stigmatise them and to make their life risky. So essentially, I did my research and I realised that our current drug prohibition laws, they actually cause more problems than they solve, and the best approach would actually be to legalise drugs. That was my underlying idea when I wrote this comic, but I realised that only 1/3 of the Australian population believes that drugs should be legalised. So if I was to write a Captain Planet propaganda type comic, maybe 1/3 of the population would think it's the best thing ever, but the other 2/3 would instantly not even listen to it. So I've got a homework assignment for you guys, which is to go and read my comic War on Drugs and have a look at the storytelling approach that I've taken for telling my story. I have avoided the Captain Planet approach, and hopefully you'll agree with me that I've tried to build a bridge to the other 2/3 of the population. So read the comic, have a look for the snooker ball that I've left in the corner pocket of the table, and think about whether you want to take the shot.
There's a really interesting issue there of how didactic a cartoonist can afford to be and how much your own views should shine through in your comics. Anyway, I'm not expecting you necessarily to answer that difficult philosophical question, Geoff, but our third speaker today, Geoff Pryor.
First of all, I'll just pick up on a point that David made about journalists and facts. On my regular drives to Captain's Flat, I'd often have a discussion with my brother that went something like, "Who wrote that story in the paper on Wednesday? I've never read such bullshit in all my life." And then it was up to me to defend the indefensible, because I, more often than not, agreed with him. And this points to one of the problems of communicating science. Journalists are not known for their statistical ability, their ability to read figures and to make sense of them. Journalists are also generalists. Somebody handed a press release on a science story today was probably writing about homeless people or an Aboriginal story the day before. So has to very suddenly come up to some sort of speed on the subject, and it's not surprising that things are wrong. And also, the media constantly publishes stories giving them weight that they don't deserve. And one that comes to mind, I think it was a story about a statistical anomaly linking the use of daily use of low-dose aspirin to macular degeneration. Now, I think this was last year sometime, and it caused some concern for people using low-dose aspirin like I do every day. And of course, it was nothing more than a statistical blip that somebody had noticed and pointed out and was duly reported, but of course the media, needing to be definitive and to dramatise everything, made it a medically proved link, and it was nothing of the sort. Now, another couple of things that David said in drawing cartoons, that the need not to be too didactic. In fact, it's often said that the best cartoons have no caption at all. Now, that's not always possible. I did cartoons from time to time which didn't have a caption, and it was very pleasing, but all of them, you needed some words to put into people's mouth. But it was a challenge to keep the caption short. I remember one bit of advice I got from Larry Pickering, who was my predecessor at the Canberra Times. He said, "Mate, don't write your caption underneath the drawing. Make sure you stick it in a voice bubble somewhere in the drawing." And his thinking was that the editor can never get hold of it and double think you and change it. It's there, it's part of the composition of the drawing, and it's very true. Another thing too is that you've thought of an idea, you've sat there, you've worked an idea up in your mind, and personally I would never start drawing, or tried not to start drawing, until I had a pretty clear image, because trying to resolve something on the page was messy, time-consuming, and nearly always disappointing. So developing this image, it might involve a number of elements without which the cartoon won't work. They have to go into the drawing, and David will know what I'm talking about here, that you have to weave the composition of the drawing around these elements. They can be people, things that are being said, some of the furniture even, which is relevant, but they're necessary to the idea. So that's a challenge there. Now, I did thousands of cartoons over time, and I've got many lever arch folders. I dutifully copied out the cartoon each day, stuck it into a folder. That was my duplicate copy, and I quickly went through, and these are not in any date order, and made a very quick pick, but I think they sort of illustrate different aspects of how they're approached. Now, this of course is a Japanese restaurant, and the waitress is saying, "Who asked for the scientific research?" And of course on one of the plates there's a big lump of what looks like whale blubber. And so hopefully that would speak for itself. I didn't have to label it as whale blubber. It was the whaling story was in the newspapers at the time. And so that's an instance of trying to keep the caption down to a minimum. Of course, it's also important that the food is not presented sushi style. Otherwise, if you've got a little speck of whale blubber on the plate, it doesn't work, it's useless. So it had to be something obscenely large, to dominate the drawing. So, yes, jolly Japanese, enjoying their scientific research. Try the next one. Okay, I think this one, that was 04. I think Howard had, in the lead-up, was starting to come up to the... I can't remember when there was an election then or not. That may have been the Latham election. And I think Howard, there was some pressure on the government to make some statement about logging in the forest to try and save some of the Tasmanian vote. And so this is drawn by a Howard hater, and it's one of these unlikely scene cartoons. How unlikely can you have the little sprite of the forest expressing empathy, being looked upon by a grizzly logger, and I've seen a few of those guys too, and he's not sort of even astonished. He's sort of looking to say, well, what the hell is this? As the little spirit of the forest goes dancing by. And that's the sort of drawing I love to do. It was one that I felt that it said it's cynical, disbelieving and places no weight on the government's attempts to show its forest, saving the forest credentials. I thought it was bullshit then, and that's what I tried to say. Okay. Now this one here, this one was drawn, I think, after one of my conversations with my brother. I think science funding had been cut once again, and here we've got John Button and Barry Jones. And Button, this is back in the days when we used to have science ministers, and Barry Jones is Minister for Science. He's the junior minister, and John Button, Minister for Industry and Commerce, is his senior minister. Science is part of Button's larger portfolio. And this is about the time that the Rain Man came out. And of course, being Barry Jones, it couldn't be the Rain Man, it had to be the Systemic Precipitation Man. And Barry is playing, well, he's the Dustin Hoffman, and John Button, Cluey, smart, streetwise, is the Tom Cruise. Now, I'll read that out. It's also the time of the Academy Awards, which is a sort of a given metaphor for cartoonists. When the movies come out, you think of a way of using the Academy hot movie as a basis for a cartoon. And underneath it says, the story of an autistic genius with a limitless capacity for remembering facts and figures, but who could not perform the simple everyday things in life, like formulating a policy for the funding of scientific research and steering it through cabinet. Now, Jones himself confessed that he was a lousy science minister, that he wasn't very successful in cabinet. He allowed the hard heads to walk all over him. But in saying this, I wasn't very proud of this cartoon, because afterwards I wished I hadn't drawn it, because even though Jones was not a successful politician, in the sense that he held up his bat at his end of the crease, he was a better human being than just about all of them put together, and so I felt that I'd demeaned him, and yeah, it was a bit.
I don't think it's cruel.
Okay, that's good, but I did at the time, and I thought,
Yeah, I think it's pretty cruel. I think it's pretty cruel.
Thank you, Toss. Anyway, yeah. Next. This is the sort of the standard State of the Planet cartoon. This was drawn in 1989 too, and it's a time when global pollution is big news story, and what better than to draw the globe, planet Earth, is a sort of a leaking oil drum spilling out its contents, its oily contents all over the place, with wisps of vapour, probably noxious, and all that entails. So yes, it was drawn to be stunning, eye-catching, a lot of work going into it, a lot of hatching work, and a lot of thought given to its dramatic presentation. And one of the things about drawing a cartoon in a paper, the cartoon sits on a page which is full of print. You've got the editorial one side or up above, I don't know, what do we do now? But then you've got the letters. Well, in my day, it was letters all around it, editorial, op-ed, often an illustration on the op-ed page, but on the cartoon page, a sea of grey print. And so in that space, which was my privilege to fill each day, I was determined to produce an image which would catch the eye, which would draw the reader's eye in, and that was most important. So anyway, I'll leave it there, Toss, and kept it short, I think.
I think there's a certain quality of being a genius to be a cartoonist, all that balancing between politics and science and all the other things. Great talks, guys. Now, look, an opportunity for questions, but why don't we have a break for 2 or 3 minutes just to let you get drinks and so on, and we'll reconvene in 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll get the panel assembled and sober out the front, and then you can ask them questions. All right, ladies and gentlemen, questions? Questions, anyone? Questions? Now, we need to pick this up on the audio, so you could either come and use my microphone or I'll repeat your question, whichever you like. Questions?
Hey,
Comments?
I've got a question for David. I was thinking about...
Wasn't quite what I'd planned, but still.
I was thinking about buying the Canberra Times tomorrow. Is it just going to be a normal issue that's in print tomorrow, or is there going to be something a bit different?
There's going to be something a bit different tomorrow, Stuart. I didn't even line this up. It's just happened.
So drink tokens.
No, I did a little map of Lake Burley, Griffin that's in the paper tomorrow, and because it was the 50th birthday of the lake today, and the paper's been having a debate about the lake, and there's been some really interesting stuff on the ecology of the lake and its ecological values, and that's been good to see. So it's a big cartoon, and it has a few touches on that a little bit. Yeah. Buy the paper.
Okay, so in my opinion, there are some amazing cartoonists. First Dog on the Moon, Lunig come to mind. Obviously, you guys, great. And then there are some awful, awful cartoonists. I guess my question is, what do you see the role of the cartoonist in communication? Do you think you can narrow it down and say that all cartoonists perform the same role, or do you think everyone's different?
Anyone?
I'll have a crack at that. I don't think there's a single role, and I think that's the great thing about the medium, is there's lots of different ways of using it. So Stuart, is an example of using it in a long form, tells these long stories, can get a lot of information across, but tell it in weaving an engaging story. First Dog, writes these great stream of consciousness
as well, aren't they?
screeds, and with these delightful drawings along with it.
He uses words and gets away with it.
Well, he's a writer who draws, and so there's lots of different ways you can use the medium. And I guess when I was showing the stuff before, I was trying to show some stuff that may or may not have worked so well in trying to talk about the limits of the medium in the form that I work, which is the single panel thing, in terms of getting information across. And that I actually don't see that's the strongest part of what I do. The stronger part is actually making a comment on the politics around it rather than conveying information. So I was trying to dig out stuff that might be of interest here, but for me it's much more about making comment and finding a way to do. The great power of cartoons is they operate at a sort of almost sub-rational level. The power of the image is such a strong thing, and that's what you're drawing upon to deliver a political comment. It opens people up to being receptive to it, because usually there's an unspoken contract. There'll be an element of humour or engagement with because of the drawing, and that's what I'm relying on, so that even those who might disagree with me might find some entertainment out of it too, and will be more receptive to it. But I'm also aware that in terms of changing minds, I don't have any illusions about what I do. I think the power of the cartoons that I do are much more about reinforcing prejudices than changing minds. I think it's actually much more about people will stick it on the fridge because it confirms their view, rather than that's really challenged my view of this, I'm going to stick it on the fridge to be reminded of it every day. That's not why you put it on the fridge. Yeah. And so, but I actually don't mind that. And on this issue, like climate, I think there's a role for saying there's a whole lot of us who are really frustrated with the way our political system is dealing with this information that's coming to us from people doing the science. And in a way, I want to reinforce that. I want to say to those people, you're not alone. A lot of us feel like that, and I don't think that's a bad role. It's a limited role, but I see that as part of the role of the stuff that I do. But it's different again to what a lot of other people do.
Yes, it's not a matter of trying to preach to the converted. I agree with David here. That a politician may hate what you're doing, and sometimes they do, and sometimes it fills you with glee because you get feedback which will tell you that. But you're not going to change one political mind, and that's, if you set out to do that, I suppose it's like the endless debate in art generally, that art is politics or art is trying to change the world. Well, no, I don't think it happens. for me, it was always trying to present a point of view which you felt would resonate with the reader and would be something that that they would it would perhaps help them to clear their own minds on an issue in the way that it cleared yours when you were thinking up the idea to draw it. And as I think it was mentioned, that there's only a tiny time for the cartoon to be read and absorbed, and as somebody once said to me, it's the time it takes for the spoon of cereal to leave the bowl and get to the mouth, and that's about it. That's the shelf life.
But Geoff, you've been a bit hard. It changes things to the extent that, I mean, I find inspiration from other people's creative work, you know, whether it's music or things, and it's not necessarily a didactic political argument that's being had, but it helps me go about doing what I'm doing and hopefully making changes more generally. So I'm not so negative about its impact, you know, that it doesn't change anything. You're hoping, just as you're inspired by other people's stuff, that in some ways, you know, it'll give people a little kick along as well.
Yes.
Stuart, do you see your role as being more of a storyteller, and do you think you have more of a didactic element to your work?
I don't know what didactic means.
Oh, sorry. Trying to persuade people to your frame of mind.
What does persuade? Oh, no. Well, just to follow up on what these two guys were saying, I've been in the position where I think I have changed people's minds on a particular issue, particularly with the War on Drugs comic. Earlier I talked about how only 1/3 of the population innately believes we should legalise drugs and 2/3 disagree. But as I mentioned before, the way I phrased or wrote my War on Drugs comic, I actually had people coming up to me saying, look, I hate drugs and I never thought I'd be saying this, but I actually agree with you that the current situation doesn't work and that what you're saying makes sense. So I think in that case, rather than coming at people with a bulldozer and actually trying to go through the side door and trying to, you know, get in between the brain a little bit, I was able to, and as I said before, getting people to come to their own conclusions and pop the snooker ball at the end of the comic rather than me putting a Captain Planet piece of propaganda. I have had people say, hey, look, you have changed my mind on this issue.
Okay, next question.
The plethora of social media and opportunities to engage with people now is obviously much more than it was, and you having a chat with your brother, Geoff, and just looking at some of your cartoons, Stuart, as well, how often do you take feedback from people and think, hey, that's a really good idea? Because I'm sure there are a lot of closet cartoonists out there with ideas that perhaps would be stimulating and provide you with a lot of ideas, such as the G20 summit being a gathering of warlords with you know, President Obama with the War on Drugs medal and Putin with the war on Chechnya and others, and Tony Abbott with the war on climate change. Some of those sort of ideas, I guess, would be interesting. How much feedback do you take from the public and turn those into cartoons?
Well, I was just going to say that's interesting question. One of the least appreciated phone calls. Oh, well, no, that's not quite true. Always appreciated feedback with the public, but the suggested idea. It might involve a cast of millions. It might involve plenty of hot action, and it might have been appropriate to have done it 3 days ago. So people mean well, and it was always appreciated, but always had a resistance to using suggested ideas. It was something inside me said, no, this is my job. And occasionally, you know, you'd overhear something, a comment, and it would trigger off a thought process and, hey, there's a cartoon in that. But no, I didn't get, I didn't respond much to that sort of feedback. Of suggested
Are you on
ideas.
Facebook or Twitter at all, Geoff?
No.
So if when you are on Facebook and Twitter and something happens, every joke under the sun is made about that thing in the first 20 minutes after it happens. So if you're on it, you get exposed to all of this stuff. And I find there's a number of occasions where a cartoon's been triggered by something that someone I follow has said, and I've discussed it with them, and I've put a little acknowledgement. You know, it's led to a cartoon. It's been built on. and I'd actually want to encourage that. I actually think I want to find some way to draw in people's contribution and build on it and acknowledge it. You know, that it's humour is a collective process. It's unlike, we have this idea that, you know, and maybe the way we've worked in the past has been we sit at an office and we read the news, you know, we take in this information and we process it, and then out comes the great idea, and then we pass it on. And it's the process is, but it's never, and it was never like that. I mean, Geoff would be bringing people and talking to people and getting ideas and, you know, and filtering it, and now it's happening with people in a way that everyone else can see it happening at the same time. Like, it's a really strange process, and a number of people are trying to work out ways of making that more of a collective, sort of open, acknowledged thing. Yeah. So I'm trying to work out how to do it, and a number of occasions that's happened where someone has said, "Hey, what about this?" And then we've had a discussion. Oh, yeah, and that leads to that, and you create a cartoon comes out of it. And yeah,
I think I'm more on Geoff's side of the fence than David's. I think one of my bugbears is I tell people I'm a cartoonist and they instantly suggest ideas for things I should draw about. And that really rubs me the wrong way. Like, it's almost like saying, you don't know how to do your job, I'm going to give you suggestions as to what you should write about. And especially, I guess I always try and be one step ahead of my readers as well, because my most recent comic on my website is Rat Park, and now I'm getting all these people emailing me these experiments involving rats, as though I'm just going to keep on doing rat-themed comics from now on. But I can't dwell on the past. I've got to keep moving forward, and there's a right way and a wrong way to go about it. There's the way which is, for example, Rat Park I first heard about from my brother, who emailed me a link to the Wikipedia article for Rat Park, and he said, "Hey, you might like this experiment." But if he would have said, "Hey, you should draw a comic about this," that would have got my back up, and I probably wouldn't have even considered doing it. But I'm constantly looking for things to draw about, but if people try and push me into things, then I tend to get my back up a bit and resist.
I get a lot of people sending email ideas, and as Geoff said, some of them are just unworkable or
awful.
Or
just
awful. Yeah, some are awful, but then others aren't. And there's one person who on Twitter will direct message me observations, and we have a little conversation. And on a couple of occasions, the conversation's led to a cartoon. But the great thing is they don't expect me to draw something if they suggest it. They're not offended if I completely ignore it. And if I use it...
So it's just grist for your mill, and you can...
Well, I think you want to build I actually like the idea of building a community around these issues where you have commonality to find a better way to communicate these ideas.
Well,
yeah.
It's true that...
And Andrew's really good at that. First Dog, Andrew has really pioneered that. I mean, because he's, king of Twitter, and he... he's done whole cartoons where it's just been stuff fed to him from people who, the readers, and he's weaved it into a lovely piece. Yeah, I think that's a great thing.
I think First Dog sends more tweets per day than I send per year. So.
Yes, well, I missed out on the social media completely. Yes, I'm not sorry in the least. But there's another aspect too. It's the way that the public perceive what you do. You're regarded as a comedian. You make people laugh. It's true to say that the traditional role of the cartoonist has evolved into being a court jester. The cartoonist is the only person in the newspaper who can tell the emperor that he has no clothes. The print journos try it and will be sued. But cartoonists, thanks to Patrick Cook and Harry Seidler, a famous celebrated defamation case a number of years ago, which Patrick Cook won, cartoons are open to so many different interpretations that it's hard to be definitive about them in a defamatory sort of way, or from the point of view of a lawyer running a case. So at the same time, being seen as a comedian has its downside, because we all know that it's almost a cliche that comedians are some of the saddest people on earth. You know, the numbers of comics who have topped themselves for one reason or another, often being bipolar, manic depressives. Well, Robin Williams, I mean, most obviously of late, their ability to make people just fall about laughing is often in their manic side, and then there's the downside. But from the cartoonist point of view, there's also the need to comment on things which aren't funny. And they can be disasters and tragedies. And there is something that has to be said which describes the world condition in which this disaster or tragedy has happened. And it will be guaranteed to bring in outraged correspondence from readers who think that you even approaching this subject is disgraceful because you are treating it lightly because you are a cartoonist without ever reading the editorial comment for what it's saying. You know, it's just that straight knee-jerk reaction.
That might be a nice lead into my question. Thanks very much for the insights, gentlemen. They're great. Each of you have touched on the audience in one way or another, and humour is in the eye of the beholder. You can't make people take the obvious shot, and some cultures actually like to be led that way. I'd appreciate a bit of comment on how you actually recognise those differences in your different audiences. Work published in France may not be read the same way as will be published in Australia, for example.
Well, the Canberra Times is a small newspaper. It's getting smaller. That's the nature of the business these days. Circulation's been plummeting for a while now. But it's a paper which has a reliable readership in you that you know. You know who your readers are. Your readers are people more or less educated across policy issues. They know government. This is a mill town where the main business in the town is government, and it's a readership also that it's Canberra's small enough, and David would know this, perhaps Stuart, that the public own you. They read your work every day, and there's a proprietorial sense, so that. I used to have somebody come up to me in the supermarket that I'd never met, never seen, but they knew who I was, and they'd say, oh, lovely to meet you. I didn't understand that one on Tuesday. What was that about? That went right over my head. And, I'm maybe on my way to the car, loaded down with groceries or whatever. I do the shopping in our house, by the way. And this feeling that you can be accosted at their behest, you can be quizzed, you can be criticised, but at the same time, I loved it because...
So you were a public servant in a sense yourself?
Well, I was owned by the readers, and it was confirmation, which was always needed. David and I were talking about this in this business. There's almost a daily crisis of confidence. You know, is what I'm doing up to scratch? Is it any good? The number of days I'd walk out in the evening after having done a cartoon and said, by God, that was a cracker. I couldn't have done any better. I reckon I could count them on one hand. You know, usually it was...
That many.
What's that?
That many.
Yeah, that many, yeah. And a feeling of not cutting the mustard, going back over the week's work and saying, well, I reckon there was one good one in that lot. And then, of course, when I retired, people said, we love this David Pope person, but we used to love your work. And I would think, well, why in the hell didn't you tell me at the time when I needed it? But that's the nature of the business, I guess. It's a solitary business, and cartoonists are notoriously their own worst judges. When it comes to selecting work to put into competitions and things, I think most cartoonists run for cover and leave it to other people.
Are you buying into that?
Sorry?
We have one more question, but if anyone buying into that?
The audience, look, I was very nervous coming into the job following Geoff, because I spent most of my cartooning life as an outsider, drawing for the left, maybe more didactic and sort of oppositional stuff. And I always saw Geoff as he was a voice of a broader constituency, and that's the role of the cartoon in the paper. And I was very nervous about that, about how I was going to go in that role. And I haven't followed Geoff. I've done my own thing, and I've just had to. I haven't managed to be that sort of person.
It took him about a day, actually.
But because the readership is, as you say, it's a very educated readership.
It's a knowing readership, isn't it?
But it's also divided readership, and not half or a big chunk of the readership don't agree with me. So and you just have to roll with that and hope that they'll find something out of some of the stuff that you do that
H. Ronald
will
from
tickle their.
Girabombra comes to mind.
And we get the letters, so I'm aware that it doesn't. I'm not the voice for everyone, and so for me, my role at the paper is, and I play that role at the paper too. Is I'm not an insider. Sometimes you got to play the insider, and sometimes you got to play the outsider. Like sometimes you've got to be part of it, but outside of it, it's a really strange sort of relationship.
My situation's very different in that the vast minority of my readers are Australian and the vast majority are from the USA. And if you go on my website, you'll see there's a little English, Great Britain flag in the top right-hand corner. And if you drop that down, you can see my comics are actually translated into 8 or 9 other languages. So I've just, on the weekend, launched the French version of my website. So it's very global, and I guess my style of, I've read all of the how to be a successful webcomic articles, which is very much like you must produce 5 comics a day, you must be active on social media, you must do this and that, and I'm essentially breaking all of the rules. Like people probably assume I'm dead at the moment because I haven't published anything since May 2013. And my next one will be in sort of early 2015, which will be this 120-page comic that I'm working on at the moment, which will take people 20 minutes to read, whereas normally it takes people 20 seconds to read a comic. So I'm very anti-commercial, but I seem to be succeeding on some terms at the moment.
Last question.
With news increasingly moving to being on that 24-hour cycle and people more and more getting their news from online sources rather than from print newspaper, how do you see that impacting on the political cartoonist, and where do you see the role going in the future?
Well, I kind of feel like I'm in an industry that's on its way out. That it'll be how you can make a living as a web artist after this period. I feel like I was the last staff cartoonist through the door before the changes that are happening, and I don't know how long. No one knows how long they've got a job in the industry. Having said that, I mean the paper's circulation is shrinking. Its readership is. Online is strong, but it's just not going to have the same revenues as it had in the past, and its work is shared online. So that's the other thing, is stuff shared online. People get up and check their Facebook and their Twitter feed for the news, but more often than not, they're sharing stuff from mainstream journalists who have gone out and dug stuff up on, like today, Phil Dorling's story on the WikiLeaks drop on the Trans-Pacific Partnership chapter. So it's how we're going to fund journalists like that, and maybe cartoonists as well. But we're not as essential as as the journalists, and a smaller pool of journalists in these organisations. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. But I was a freelancer for most of my cartooning time, so. And it's hard graft, Stuart.
Well, I've got a lot of rat-themed comics I can pass off to you.
Yeah, right. So and we've seen in the US the dramatic change in the newspaper industry there, and the vast numbers of editorial cartoonists who were laid off in the last 10 years. So
I was a couple of years ago visiting Washington and just happened to drop into the museum, which is the News Media Museum. It's a great museum. They have a studio fully equipped where they do produce little programs for, I suppose, various formats. And this was a panel discussion like this with 3 American cartoonists and one who was in the social media, who was generating his own product, so to speak, all the spin-offs from it. And another one who worked for the New Orleans Picayune? Mm-hmm. And he was just about in his last week because his newspaper was about to fold. And this has been happening all over the States. They're just disappearing. As for what happens now with online publications, I'm not sure quite how the cartoon fits into that. It's difficult to see. It's a sort of a time-honoured form of expression, and Australia has always prided itself on its cartoonists over the years, since the old bulletin days. In fact, I think, with some conceit, thinking that, we're a bunch of sort of happy-go-lucky guys who don't respect power and will say anything, and we're pretty tough on it. But I once talked to a Turkish cartoonist who'd been flung into a cell by the military junta and had a leg broken for his troubles, and that really pulled me up because I thought to myself, it makes my work pretty piss weak compared to what had happened to him. But what happens to the future of cartooning is difficult, really.
But it's difficult for our jobs. But the graphic industry, the graphic culture has exploded. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, and Stuart stuff's an example of that. But the whole mini comics and comics scene is massive. And I mean, there's a group here in Canberra that meets regularly, and that's what's really interesting. The paid opportunities are far less, but the culture itself has never been stronger, and is.
Well, it's changed for everybody. You try having lunch with a journalist, getting 5 minutes continuous conversation out of him because he'll have his tablet out. I remember lunching with Tony Wright a few times, have his tablet out. He said, I've just got to do this, and updating a story which he'll send back. And this is going on all day long. Or he's taking calls from his editor, wanting to know about this particular aspect of the story, which he filed at 9 o'clock that morning, and something else has happened. And there's this constant updating and updating. Well, where does the cartoonist art fit into that? It's...
Well, I like to think there'll still be space for a hand-drawn image somewhere.
Yes.
That it'll still be valued, and particularly in a world of moving images, which is the internet. The internet is just...
Yeah. And
there's something about the still hand-drawn image, I think, that will have some appeal.
Like Rocco Fazari's little animations in the SMH each day.
And I think publications can be defined by their editorial cartoonists, like you guys in the Canberra Times. First Dog on the Moon was very integral to the Crikey branding when he was with them. Sean Lee in Queensland.
Yes.
I'm going to end the conversation now. It's been a wonderful conversation. I have to say that my observation is that cartoons are the third most frequently read page in a newspaper. In Australia, it's usually back page, front page, cartoon, and then comics is the way it goes. So I think in some ways in the last 20 years we've had a golden age of cartooning in Australia. There are some wonderful, wonderful cartoonists and social commentators around the place, and we're blessed with 2 of them here. And Stuart, I hope you join the ranks as your... But you'll probably have a completely different career, expanding out. What is it, your 6th language, or no, your 8th language now on your website? So it's all going to change, I think, is the answer to your question down the front there. But please join with me in thanking David and Stuart and Geoff, and let the conversations continue in the bar afterwards. So thanks very much, guys.